I'm knocking on the door. Nobody's answering. Then a guy opens the door. And I have my gun drawn. I'm facing it towards this person as he's running towards me. And I can see this look in his eyes. He's bloodshot. They're watery. He's angry. He's not saying a word. He's just looking at both Max and I with the knife. And he slams the door shut and locks it.
Welcome to Critical Incidents Podcast, where we explore life-defining moments. I'm your host, Kyle Ashley, a law enforcement veteran with over a decade of experience. Each episode, I'll be interviewing people about their own critical incident, a moment in their lives that shaped who they are today. From life-threatening emergencies to personal struggles, we'll hear firsthand accounts of resilience, determination, and the power of the human spirit. So sit back and let's dive into the critical incidents that shaped their lives and made them who they are.
My name is Derrick Levasseur. I'm a former police detective, and also I was a police sergeant. And my critical incident is a police-involved shooting.
Tell me why you wanted to become a police officer.
So when I was about 20 years old, I was playing baseball at college, and I was taking criminal justice because it seemed like an interesting course. I was planning on going to transferring to a different school for my junior and senior year. I was home for the summer, and I was at the summer park that I worked at every summer, and the police chief at the time had came down to the park. Now, he had known me since I was a young kid. Didn't have the best childhood, got in a lot of fights, but I was someone who didn't go looking for problems, but if someone came to me with one, I wasn't one to back down. And the chief knew this about me. He had known me growing up, and he had asked me while we were sitting at the park, what are your aspirations? Like, what are you going to do with your degree after you get done? And I said, I don't know. I don't know where I'm going to go. I might become a cop at some point. And he said, well, why not now? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we're actually taking applicants right now. I said, Chief, I'm only 20 years old. He said, well, you're probably not going to get hired, but why wouldn't you take the test to at least get some experience to see what the test is like and see what the physical requirements are and go from there? And so I said, all right, no problem. I was 20 years old. I'll do the test. I'm home for the summer. Why not? So as you know, Kyle, I mean, you've been through it. It's probably 400 or 500 people that end up applying for the job. You take a written, and then you do the physical, and then you do a psychological if you get to that point. Well, I scored really well on the written, so I did the physical. And on the physical, it's just a matter of passing. It's a yay or nay. Either you pass all the requirements or you don't. I passed that. Then I did the psychological, and even at this point, I mean, I was doing well, but I didn't think I was going to get hired. Then I get a call from the chief, go into his office, and he says, hey, I got an interesting scenario here. And I said, what's that? And he said, well, you took the test and you finished first out of everybody. So it puts me in a kind of an interesting predicament here because, frankly, you are very young. You can't even buy your own bullets yet. But here you are finishing first. You pass all the requirements. And I think you are a member of this community. And I think you'd be a good asset to the department if you're interested. So I didn't give him an answer then. I went home and I thought about it. And I thought about what I could do for the city because I still was close with a lot of people who lived there. And I felt like some of the cops that I had encountered over the years in Central Falls weren't necessarily the best. And I realized that, it was something that I was going to school for. And unfortunately for me, I knew that I wasn't going to end up playing professional baseball, even though I was playing baseball in college already. I definitely wasn't talented enough to play at the next level. So I was also poor at that point, college student, and $40,000 a year at the time. This was 2003, 2004. I was like, hey, it's a good amount of money. I could make a difference and I can start my life. So I went back in and decided to take the job.
Tell me about your career and how you go through the academy, get started, go out on patrol. Generally, most police departments, they start out on patrol. Tell me about that experience, your first couple of years on the road and as a police officer.
Yeah. So like I said, I got on when I was 20. I graduated when I was 20 from the academy. I went on to FTO, field training officer training, where you go out there and you're with another guy. I turned 21 while I was in FTO, and then I started patrol. I was on 4 to midnight, and we work a 4 and 2 schedule. And I was doing great. Loved the job. Immediately fell in love with it as soon as I got on. Realized it's what I was meant to do. And then I got an interesting call. So what actually happened was right when I had turned 21, right when I was getting off FTO, I had gone out that night with some friends and family. My girlfriend at the time was in town. My buddies were in town from Connecticut. So we stayed at a hotel, had a party, whatever. So I get a call at around 8:00 in the morning. And sure enough, it's the chief of police, the same guy who hired me. And he says, "Hey, Derrick, happy birthday." "Oh, thanks, chief." And as you know, you don't normally get calls from the chief. That's not how it works, especially as a guy who just graduated FTO. And so he goes, "Listen, I have an interesting scenario for you, and I want to see if you're up for it." And I said, "Okay, what's that?" And he said, "Well, we have a school, a university in Rhode Island, where there's allegedly a lot of drugs being passed around, a lot of date rape drugs, and they're looking for someone to go into this from an outside agency to go into this university and pose as a student for a few nights to see if they can find out who's selling the drugs and where they're keeping them." So obviously, this is what you dream of doing, right? I mean, as a patrolman, this is what you think about when you think about, I want to be a cop. This is what you think about. So I was like, "Yep, I'm on my way." So I remember taking everyone to breakfast and being like, "You got to go," because we had a whole day planned. But I was like, you got to go. So I go to the police department. They have your eyes and your ears. So I have 2 detectives with me from my department. We drive up to the other agency. They had pinned someone with drugs. He was going to introduce me as his buddy from New York, and I was going to go in there, just try to infiltrate the group of individuals who were allegedly selling the drugs and try to see if I get close with them. And to make a long story short, I actually did really well at it. I got along with them great, considering I was close to their age to begin with. It wasn't that hard. I mean, they're doing keg stands. I was doing that 6 months earlier. So it wasn't that far of a reach for me at that point. So I'm in there. I get close with the guys. Fortunately, I'm able to get close with the main target. And we're in his room and we're drinking. We're playing video games. And there's a PlayStation and an Xbox. We're playing on the Xbox. And he's talking about his operation and all he's bragging about it, all these things. And he says to me, you know why they'll never catch me? And he turns around the PlayStation that's sitting right next to it, and it was hollowed out and it had all the drugs inside of it. So I said, "Well, you're right, man. They'll never get you." And the next morning they were conducting a search warrant. But so it was very successful. We ended up arresting in total. There was 11 people arrested in that operation. And, it was a one-off for me, but it was something right then and there where I knew the trajectory of where I wanted to go in my career, what I wanted to do. I still had to put in my time as a patrolman, and I did patrol for about 3.5 years before I was put into any other type of detective role. But it was one of those things where at that moment, I knew what I was striving for. I knew I wanted to do in some capacity, special investigations unit, narcotics, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, you are 100% correct when, people think about, I want to become a police officer. And then you think, Jump Street kind of, hopping into this college environment, right?
Yeah, exactly. It really was, man. I remember being in there and having like this outer body experience where I'm like, I just graduated college to be a cop, and now I'm back in college. Again, it was really weird, but it went well. I was fortunate where over the years, while I was in patrol for that 3.5 years, and this, your listeners may not, but a lot of times when local agencies are going to do like a local undercover operation, they won't usually use officers from their own agency because the people they're going after may recognize them. So what we usually do is like lease out people. So they'll say, "Hey, do you have someone who fits this role?" "Yeah, sure." And then down the road, we'll use someone from their department. So as you can imagine, there wasn't a ton of people who were 21 years old. And then on top of being 21, when I was 21, I looked like I was like 18. So I looked really young, and word got out there about, who I was and how I looked. And they kept getting calls about me from different agencies, even agencies in other states, to come up and do work for them. So even though I was in patrol and that was my main function, I was still doing periodically throughout those 3 years, undercover operations in that capacity where, I was a drug dealer, I was a student, I was a, local kid from a high school, whatever it might be. I was doing these things and making these connections with all of these seasoned detectives. And as I did it, the more and more, all I wanted to do was investigations. But yeah, as you're saying, everyone thinks you got to do the Jump Street role, but you got to earn your stripes and do the patrol thing first.
100%. And a lot of our experience, especially when it comes to police work, of just like talking with people and going and, wearing a badge and a uniform, and the way that we conduct ourselves is completely different from like making traffic stops and responding to domestics than it's going to be from undercover work where you're pretending to be somebody else, but still using your personality. So that's definitely an interesting take on the start of your career versus what the majority of police officers they experience.
Yeah, it wasn't traditional. And it was interesting because I would do an undercover op on a Saturday or Sunday. But then on Monday or Tuesday, when I'm coming back from my shift, I'd be writing tickets, responding to calls. So it was this really weird situation. We could dive into it. We don't have to. But the other issue that I was facing personally was there was some jealousy, where you have other patrolmen who are like, why is this guy getting to do this when he just got on and I can't? And you get people with you think you're better than everyone, whatever. There's politics in law enforcement, just like any other profession. So on top of learning the job, I was dealing with that as a rookie. So it was an interesting time in my life for me. I grew up really, really fast because I had to, not only because of the things I was dealing with as a police officer, but to be honest with you, being a police officer was really my first actual job, my actual career. Before that, I had just been working part-time on a lot of different things as a kid. That was my first real job.
Yeah, that's some big shoes to fill too. Just a quick snippet on that. Something that I experienced was you're so young when you start this job. Most police officers are, and you're responding to calls where there are full-grown adults your parents' age that you have to tell just did something wrong. And it feels so weird and odd when you first started doing it. A lot of officers experience that, but it's definitely like a culture shock of a sorts. You know what I mean?
100%. You're going in there trying to mediate a domestic dispute between two 30, 40-year-olds, and you're 20, and they're looking at you like, what are you going to tell us, kid? And that's definitely something I had to deal with, had to overcome. And yeah, it's a challenge for sure. No doubt about it. It was definitely never anything I had experienced before that.
So you do undercover work. You're also doing patrol. You're a few years into this. Where does your career take you from there?
So for me, I did 3.5, almost 4 years in patrol. Then I had the critical incident that we're going to discuss tonight. That happened. I was out of work for a while because of that, because of the procedures that go with that. And we can dive into that. And I had a decision after this incident to either retire. And I could have retired probably with a disability as far as the mental struggle that comes with that, or come back. And ultimately, I decided that I was okay, and I needed to go back for me, and I did. And I had taken the detective's test, and I was fortunate enough at that point, with about 4.5 years on, to be put into the narcotics unit. And I did, I want to say 3 years in narcotics, about 3 years in narcotics, and then I went up to full-time detective for, I believe, 2 years. And then I got promoted to sergeant, and I was back in patrol as a sergeant. But then as time progressed, I got put back in narcotics for about 2 years as a sergeant. And then I was put back in patrol before I went on the show called Big Brother. And after that, life just kind of changed after I came back, did another 3 years as a sergeant, and had some opportunities in the TV world and opening my own private investigator firm, and decided to leave after 13 years.
I was always curious at how your career progressed from, what I knew that you did to being a sergeant and then getting into the roles that you kind of hold now. So it's interesting when you say it just like that, going on a national television show and then coming back. I'm sure that was a shock of some kind, because, the show that you were on, Big Brother, was pretty popular, and it still is, and so I'm sure that people recognize you and you're like, aren't you the winner of Big Brother? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it is. It was different because when you go on Big Brother, you don't think that people are watching. You forget that the cameras are on. So when you come home, you go back to just your normal life because that's all you know. And yeah, life does change. And we had some funny things happen, in hindsight, they were funny, but we had people who were intentionally trying to have me pull them over by speeding because they wanted to meet me. We had a couple incidences where you had some women take things a little too far. We had a situation where I had a woman who was showing up at our work and our parking lot wasn't secured. So she was coming in there, leaving notes, and she actually started, no joke, she was licking my windows and drawing hearts on the window. It was an interesting situation for a 30-year-old guy to be in when I was writing tickets, 4 months earlier. So it definitely changed some things. Annoyed the new chief a little bit. He did not like it. I'll be honest with you. He hated it, actually. But he was nice enough to let me do some TV things while I was still a sergeant, where I was using my comp time to go do those things. And that's what allowed me to dip my toes into the true crime space and find out that I had a passion for it. Because to be honest with you, after Big Brother, you had agents calling and all this stuff. And I said basically no to everything. They asked me if I would be interested in Survivor, Amazing Race. I turned down everything. And then I had an agent call and he said, well, how about true crime? And that's when I got the opportunity to do the OJ series on ID. And it was a 6-part series. I got to do something in the field that I actually enjoyed working in, as opposed to just reality TV. And that's when I said, okay, we have something here. And I realized that I could reach a larger audience and actually help more people outside of this small jurisdiction that I was working in. And that's when I opened up Break Investigative Group. And that was right around the time that I was still a sergeant. I opened up that private organization because I wanted to have the ability to work cases outside of Central Falls, Rhode Island.
And I'm going to assume that when you were on Big Brother, that your time going undercover helped tremendously with that.
Yeah, that's a safe bet. Yeah, no, it was extremely helpful. And also, I would say, just being a police officer, you know this, Kyle, like dealing with so many different types of personalities, so many different cultures, so many different types of people. We have to find an ability to mediate situations with people that we may not necessarily get along with in our personal lives, that we may not agree with their personal beliefs or the way they conduct themselves when we're off duty. But you have to find commonalities even with criminals so that you can accomplish whatever mission it is you have at that time, whether it's to make an arrest without confrontation or to diffuse a altercation that's becoming possibly physical. You have to find those ways of finding that means to talk with someone, even though they're completely different from who you are. And when I was applying for Big Brother, that's essentially what I told them. My job was to find common interests with anybody and learn how to use those common interests to accomplish whatever I was trying to accomplish, which is essentially what Big Brother is.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, a lot of times it's so overlooked in police work. And I'm glad we're talking about this because I hope everyone gets to hear this side of it, is when you're a police officer, and you know this just as well as I do, when I respond to certain places, I know that the community wants me to enforce the laws that they are okay with and not ones that they don't want to. So I can respond to a neighborhood and I could say, you have guys that are girls that are smoking marijuana outside of their apartment complex in the breezeways, and nobody cares. They are like, absolutely not. They're just not bonding anybody's business. I don't care. But you go to another part of where you patrol and people are like, you need to get these people out of here. You need to arrest them and take them to jail. And so it's interesting to have that side of police work where you have to know where you're responding to and how the community wants you to enforce the laws, like how they want the police to police.
And by the way, you got to do that in a matter of minutes too, right? Like you're having to analyze the situation, calibrate the person you're dealing with, and then act on that within a matter of minutes. It's not like you have an opportunity to go, hey, I'm going back to my cruiser. Let me figure this one out and I'll get back with you. No, you're doing it on the spot. So yeah, most police officers would do very well in a game like Big Brother because of what we do every day. And then, like you said, doing the undercover work, because I didn't tell anybody I was a police officer on the show. I made up a whole new character. And a lot of that was, due to my experience as a UC.
Absolutely. That's interesting. I'm interested to hear more about that. But for now, let's talk about, you go on Big Brother, you do all this stuff. So where does the critical incident that you have kind of fall into your career here?
So it's April 8th, 2007. It's an Easter. Sunday. Okay. I'm an FTO at this point. So now instead of being trained, I'm training the new guys. And my guy had 3 days on with me. It was his third day on the job. And as you know, on the holidays, it can be hit or miss, but usually on Easter, it's dead. We didn't really have anything going on. So we were actually, most of us were inside the station because, again, Central Falls is small. We can respond to every location within a matter of seconds right from the station. So I was in there filling out paperwork with him, just the general stuff you do before a shift. And we received a call for a 911 hang up. And now I know you know what that is, and most people may, but for most law enforcement officers, you don't want to respond to any call and be complacent. But I will tell you, when you get a 911 hang up, usually like, oh man, I got to go to this, because more than likely you're going to get there and it's just the phone's off the hook or a kid's playing with the buttons and it's going to be a 2-second call and you're on your way. Right. So we were really dead that night and I didn't even get sent to that call. One of my partners did. And so his name was Maximilio Gonzalez. And so they sent him and I said, you know what, 37, we're going to back him up. We're going to go that way as well. That was my badge number at the time. We're going to back him up only because I wouldn't normally back him up on a 911 hang up, but I had this new recruit. So I wanted to get him I wanted to get his feet wet and get him out on the road because obviously he's a new guy. He's sitting at the table, chewing the table apart. He wants to get out there. So we show up and we show up simultaneously. And now Maximilio, or as I know him as Max, is Spanish. I'm not. But I know a little Spanish, not much. So we go up to, it's a triple decker. So in Central Falls, most of the houses are apartment complexes. So they're stacked on top of each other. So this particular one had 3 different floors, 3 different apartments. So we enter, we really don't know what floor it is. They didn't have that information. We just know that there's a 911 hang up. So we're going there to try to find out where it's coming from. So we get up to the 2nd floor landing of the apartment complex and there's an individual there and he's just kind of staring at us, but he's pointing to the 3rd floor. Now at this point, Max is in front of me walking up the stairs, really narrow stairway. I'm behind him and then my recruit's behind me. And so we go up to the 3rd floor landing and it's so hard in an audio podcast, but the best way I can describe it is we're going up the stairs. The apartment, there's a little bit of a landing there. I would say it's probably 4 by 6 in size, 4 feet by 6 feet in size. And there's an apartment door and directly adjacent from that apartment door is a window right on that landing to the outside. And so we go up the stairs, Max and I go up the landing and Max is now standing at the top of the stairs, right? The last stair before the landing. I'm on the landing. I kind of jumped in front of him. I don't even know how that happened, but I'm sure he was talking to the person on the 2nd floor and I kind of continued because of his hand gestures. So I get up to the 3rd floor. I'm knocking on the door. Nobody's answering. Knocking on the door. Nobody's answering. Then a guy opens the door. And again, he can't speak English. So we're trying to talk to him, but more so Max is talking to him. Now, Max, by the way, cannot see in the apartment. I can because I'm looking directly in past this guy who's now engaging in conversation in Spanish with Max. And the entire apartment, there's this big kitchen and there's these 3 rooms down this hallway, this corridor. So I can't see in the rooms. I can just see the doorways. And the only reason I can even see the doorways is because there's lights on inside the rooms, right? So I know that the doorways are there and I know there's rooms off of that. And I'm kind of doing what I should be doing, which is keeping an eye on the inside of the apartment because I don't know if someone now at this point, my spidey sense is going off, by the way. I'm realizing there's something more here. This wasn't an accident, right? But I don't know what. And I don't know if it's just a verbal dispute or whatever. So as I'm standing there, I see this, and thank God the light was on in the room. I see this figure come out of the furthest room from me. And all I can make out is his silhouette because he's backlit. So I can't see if it's a guy or a girl at the time. I can't really see much, but fortunately, by the grace of God, as he's walking out of that room, literally for a second, I could see that obviously he's giving me this bladed profile. I can see the side of his profile, right? But he had a knife in his hand down by his side. And fortunately, I was able to see the blade of the knife. Again, just the silhouette of the knife because he had it tucked by his thigh. And so as he's walking out of the room, right around his butt area, I could see that there was something that didn't line up with what I'd expect to see with a silhouette of a body that's bladed. There was a knife, clearly. And it was so interesting, Kyle, because I know you've done it. And I've done it a million times. When we're in the academy, we see a knife. What do they train you to say? Knife, knife, drop the knife, right? And you say it, knife, knife, or gun, gun. So you're letting everybody know around you. First word out of my mouth, natural reaction because of that muscle memory. I just yelled knife. And the minute I yelled knife, the subject kind of turned towards me and started walking fast towards the door, towards me. So I immediately took the guy that was standing in between us, the guy that had opened the door, and I pushed him towards Max. Now, Max doesn't know what's going on. He knows knife, so he knows something's up. He pushes the guy that I had pushed towards him by him. He, in the process, kind of pushes the FTO down the stairs. I retreat to the point where I feel this breeze on my back, and it's because my back is now in the windowsill. And I have my gun drawn. I'm facing it towards this person. As he's running towards me, he runs right towards the apartment door. He gets in the doorway. Now he has a knife above his shoulder, and I can see this look in his eyes. He's bloodshot. They're watery. He's angry. He's not saying a word. He's just looking at both Max and I with the knife, not saying anything. And this goes on. It felt like minutes, but it was probably only about 30 seconds. And I'm yelling, drop the knife. Max is yelling, drop the knife in Spanish. He's not doing it. So then he backs up and he slams the door shut and locks it.
You mentioned your spidey sense, right? And so for people to articulate what they are feeling. So a lot of times everyone feels what we would consider like a spidey sense in situations when it is, something is off. And so for me, the only way I can really think about that is the atmosphere in which you are mentally perceiving should happen, right? So if I respond to a 911 hang up, my thought process is, like you were saying, like a child picked up the phone, dialed 911, someone accidentally hit SOS on their phone. It 9 out of 10 times doesn't turn into, something more than that. And so you always expect, or is always on your toes to expect the unexpected. But generally speaking, your mental process is like, oh, we just need to go here, make sure everyone's okay and leave. So your spidey senses, can you explain to me the atmosphere in which you felt changed?
Yeah, I think it's something in law enforcement. When I wrote my book, I wrote about it and I referred to it as a sixth sense, right? I feel like as a police officer, you develop this understanding of what you're walking into, and almost immediately you can tell the temperature of the room where things are adding up or they're not. And I feel like you get this heightened sense of awareness when you ask a particular question or you get a particular response, or these verbal or nonverbal cues that you witness from the people that are present. You understand pretty quickly if this is going to be an easy call or it has the potential to escalate. And with this situation, the way the lights were off, the fact that these guys, they clearly didn't expect us to be there. They appeared to have been distraught and upset about something. And yet I could tell that without even understanding what he was saying in Spanish. And so for me, walking in there, usually you'll get the parents that open the door and, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't know little Joey's playing with the phone in the other room. This felt different. And it's something where it wasn't only this case that I had this feeling. You had on a lot of situations where you can tell if shit's about to hit the fan before it usually does. And it's hard to articulate because it wasn't something I had growing up. It was going to numerous calls as a patrolman where it started off normal, and before you know it, you're fighting for your life because the guy's trying to grab your gun as you're rolling around on the floor. And after going through that situation so many times, you start to develop an understanding of what to expect when those situations present themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was a great explanation of it. I think a lot of things come from, we do enough training in the academy where you're trying to create that environment of like what it might feel like when you run into this. But when you're actually doing it, you learn unconsciously what you are looking for. It comes to you as you get more experience doing these things, and you walk up and talk with someone and their demeanor is completely different, and you recognize this is the last time someone was like this in front of me, this happened. I think you just unconsciously remember those things and your body reacts to that.
Yep, absolutely.
I think that's a great explanation. So you can feel this environment changed. You have this situation that's unfolding in front of you, and there's a communication barrier, right? So you have your partner who is communicating in a different language than what you're doing, and so he closes the door and lock it, which in my mind is it's good that you got the guy out the way, but now you can't just pick up the chips and walk away. Now you have to address that situation and get that under control now. So what do you do from there?
You're right. I'm so glad you said it. And that was a point of contention that was brought up when this eventually goes to the grand jury, because it's like, hey, he shut the door. What do you do? Well, like you just said, you can't just get up and walk away. And now at this point, we're finding out that there had been an altercation before we arrived through the people that Max had been speaking with. And now at this point, we don't know if A, he's going to hurt himself inside the apartment, B, if he has someone else in there that he's going to kill now that we're here. So as you can imagine, it's an immediate reaction. We knock on the door. He doesn't open. Door is coming off the hinges. So I boot the door because we have to. That's what we have to do. We have to go in. Now we're engaged. We got to make sure we protect him and anybody else who might be inside that apartment. So as soon as I kick the door in, he's already in the kitchen. He's in the back corner. It's still dark. So now we spill in there. And at this point, obviously, we're already calling for backup. So another officer, Felipe Orsini, arrives, another seasoned officer. He arrives. So now as we spill into the apartment, it's myself, it's Max Gonzalez, Felipe Orsini, and Barry Cameron, who is the trainee. And we all have our guns drawn, but we have flashlights out. And fortunately, Felipe Orsini speaks Spanish as well. So they're telling him numerous times, drop the knife in Spanish. I'm telling him, drop the knife in English. He's just standing there. He's not moving on us. He's just holding the knife above his head. And there's no moment as I'm sitting there where he's even contemplating dropping the knife. He almost looks like he's looking past us as to how he can get out from around us and get out of the apartment. So I knew that this wasn't going to end well. This was going down a bad path. And it's hard to explain it again. Audio is always difficult, but we were kind of circled, like half circled around him. But there was still an opening for him to kind of go down the hallway if he wanted to. Maybe that was bad tactics on our part, but there was a little bit of an opening there where we spilled into the right more than the left, where he could kind of go out to the left and go back into one of the rooms if he wanted to. So that's what he did. He took a step forward. And by the way, we're like 3 feet from him at this point. So, I mean, if he makes one step forward legally, we could shoot him at that point and be legally justified, but we're really trying to avoid it. And this went on for about a minute or two where we're talking to him. We're trying to de-escalate the situation. We're trying to find out what's going on. He's not hearing it. So he slips by us and he runs down this little corridor into the back living room, not one of the bedrooms where he came out of, all the way to the end to the back living room. And just the way we were half circled, it worked out where I was the first one. Now this corridor is super small, this hallway. So we're stacked. So we're entering into this living room. There's a doorway to go into the living room and then it opens up. And I'm the first one. So I stop at the doorway because I don't know where he is. I'm not going to run in there, right? You could just stab me and it's over. But as soon as I stop at the doorway, I can see that there's one window to my right and he's trying to open it. And it's the fire escape window. And there's a piece of wood in the window and he's not realizing it, or he's definitely under, we found out later he was heavily intoxicated and he just wasn't in the right state of mind. To a little backstory, he had found out his girlfriend was cheating on him with this other guy. There was a fight. He tried stabbing both of them. He actually stabbed one of them in the foot before we got there. So he was in a really bad mental state at that point. And his name was Selvin Guardado Morales, by the way. And so he's trying to open the window. We're again yelling at him, drop the knife, drop the knife. He turns around. He looks at me for a second or two and he starts to charge right at me. And as he's doing it, he puts the knife from, right next to his ear to over his head where it's coming down on my top of my forehead or my eye. I had the gun up. I looked at him. I looked at the knife, said, drop the knife again, multiple times. He didn't drop it. And when he was 4 feet from me, I shot him. And the interesting thing about it is Maximilio was behind me. He was a Marine. He was someone who knew I wasn't afraid as a cop, but also had heard stories about police officers freezing in those moments and being killed because of it. So he was unsure if I was going to be able to pull the trigger because in hindsight, Kyle, I waited too long. He was only 4 feet away from me. And so he got nervous. He actually put his gun over my right ear and also shot him twice, but he was so focused on the knife that he shot him in the arm, which is going to be very important later in the story as far as ballistics is concerned, because the two rounds went through his forearm from the front side out the back, confirming that at the time when he was shot, his arm was in fact over his head based on the directionality of the bullets themselves. So yeah, Max shot 2 times in my ear. My ear still isn't right. It still rings sometimes. I can't hear for shit out of it. And it's because of Max, and I don't blame him. He did the right thing. But it was one of those situations where we acted on it. We probably could have acted sooner. But overall, I had shot 4 times, center mass. Max had shot twice. And unfortunately, Selvin did not survive his injuries. We immediately called for aid. They responded within minutes. They rendered aid right there on the spot, but he died at the scene. Yeah. And by the way, I'm 23 going on 24 at the time.
So digesting that, I think it's important that, we talk about entering these calls, especially when it's so heightened and you're essentially, to a degree, chasing, methodically and tactfully through an apartment, someone who is holding a knife, because a situation occurs where you don't know if there's someone else in that house. You don't know if the guy wants to hurt himself. He wants to hurt someone else. You have had one potential victim that you have now removed from this situation, and now you need to figure out if there's more. So you're tactfully going through this house, and there's a guy who you can clearly tell is not in the right state of mind, who is running around with a knife, usually above his ear, and then eventually has to charge you. But the tactful part of how you and the other officers are going through this house is something that is interesting, and I'd like to talk about for a minute, because you mentioned at one point, like, just the way that we were, semi-circled around this guy, and then going into a room, it just happened to be that you were the first one to go into that room. And I think that's important to talk about, because a lot of times police officers, when they find themselves in a situation where they're doing building clearing, or they're responding to these calls, it's not, let's put the guy that knows what they're doing. You have a Marine behind you who probably has cleared 100,000 different houses in the Marine Corps, who...
You're damn right. Yeah, he was all over the world doing it. You're right.
Who not saying that you wouldn't be, but you're a young officer, and he probably has more experience
100%
doing building clearing. So let's throw him up front. But that's just not the way that these situations play out. And I think that's important because you are dealt a situation that is almost impossible to figure out what's the best thing, because you obviously don't want to shoot this guy. You want to get him help. You want the situation to de-escalate, and you're doing that in any way you can, which is let's go put this guy in handcuffs and just figure out what the situation is, so everyone kind of goes home. But unfortunately, it doesn't play out like that. And I'm glad that you talked about, the part where the guy is coming at you and you're within that 4 foot. Obviously we train so many different scenarios, and you never want to have to pull that trigger. But when you do, you always think about, we should have done it beforehand, or we should have done it this time. And then a guy that's shooting over my shoulder just to make sure that things happen the way they do. And so it's really great the way that you articulate the situation, because it's so dynamic, and it could have changed by so differently if one thing would have been different. If he would have just went back into a room instead of going down a hallway, if he wouldn't have gone into the living room, it would have been completely different. And so it's interesting to hear perspectives on what you're capturing from your, experience, and what other people might hear and say, well, why couldn't you just tase him? Why didn't you have to throw this at him? But you have so many different things, and his idea of trying to come and stab a police officer because he's not listening to verbal commands from 2 officers who speak his language is really interesting.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the taser part, because that is something that wasn't even in question at the time. Because remember, again, this is 2007. So at the time, my police department didn't even have tasers. And to be frankly honest with you, even if they did, based on the circumstances, as you know, the tasers don't always work. So when they're that close to you, I mean, even when he was at the furthest part of this living room, he was probably only about 8 or 9 feet away from me. So even at that distance, if I would have tased him by holstering my gun, tasing him, if he would have charged me, I wouldn't have been able to get my gun out fast enough to stop the threat. And in fact, he was so close that he had gunpowder burns around the wounds from my rounds. And when I shot him, although it kind of derailed his path slightly, I still had to kind of dive out of the way, because he still kept moving forward and struck the wall right to the left of me. He ran right into the wall. He was incapacitated at that point, which is why after 4 rounds, I stopped shooting. But it was one of those things where he was still standing upright. And that's what happens in this situation when you have someone who has a knife or anything that's sharp like that. If they're within 21 feet of you, even if you fire a round, they can still get to you and injure you or even kill you. So yeah, it was a very traumatic situation, not something I would wish upon anyone. People always ask how I was able to do it. Bottom line, I was afraid, to be frankly honest with you. I thought he was going to kill me. And I knew that if I didn't shoot him, he was going to stab me. So it was a choice that I had to make. And in a way, I'm very happy that I was able to do what I needed to do in that situation to save my own life. Obviously, I would have liked things to end differently. And it was something that it took me a long time to process mentally. But one of the things that helped me was the fact that every police-involved shooting has to go to a grand jury. That's just the standard. And it gave me a lot of peace to know that Selvin's parents, who were also living in the house, testified on my behalf, essentially saying, yeah, he was not in his right state of mind that night. He was going to do something bad. And unfortunately, there was no other way around it. We knew this was going to end this way. And I was cleared that day. The grand jury convened for a couple hours. And they came back no true bill, that I was not going to be indicted for anything, and that I had acted in accordance with our policies and procedures and the law. And which, by the way, I wasn't that concerned about. I knew that would be the case. I knew I did the right thing. But to have that, not that acknowledgement, but just that understanding from his family meant the world to me as far as my mental health was concerned, because Selvin was only 27 years old. And even sitting here right now talking to you, I have no ill will towards the man. None. And I still remember him and know what he looks like to this day. And I think about him all the time, because regardless of what happened that night, we're connected forever. And, I hope in the next life, if there is a next life, we get to sit down and have a conversation about it.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a refreshing mindset to have, going through these situations. Just any kind of, obviously yours is an ultimate situation where it's like the peak of, fearing for your life and having to, make a decision to take someone else's life. And it was just to stop a threat. And ultimately he did have to pass away because of that. But, not holding any ill will towards that, I think is so good for your mental status. I think that, releasing that is not having a grudge or an ill will towards that is very healthy. And one question for you is that, in most police departments, when a shooting occurs or a critical incident, a serious incident occurs, we usually have, peer support or a psychiatrist come out and speak with you. Did you have any of those resources after this happened?
Absolutely. Absolutely. All of it. And it's a very traumatic thing, because immediately they come take your gun from you, because now they got to process it for ballistics. But that night, the peer support team was there within hours. I had around the clock people calling me, checking in on me. But the biggest help for me was our chaplain, our police chaplain, Father Joe, because it was, and I'm giving you the story, but I'm sparing some of the details out of respect for Selvin and everybody involved. But it was not a great scene, Kyle, to be honest with you. It's not like the movies, we'll put it that way, when someone's shot. And it was very traumatic for everybody there. And unfortunately, fortunately for him, Max did not come back from it. Max actually ended up leaving the job after this thing, because he didn't want to carry a gun anymore. He was over it. He was a religious man. And even though he was in the military, he had never actually killed anyone. And him and I are still very, very close. And again, we're also connected for life. But now he has a great job. He's beautiful kids. And he just said, Derrick, we talked every single day because we were going through this together. And it was just something where he was going to come back. And then he just said, you know what? I don't ever want to be in that situation again. And it almost made me not come back, but I just felt like I was cheating myself and that I would regret it if I didn't, because there were goals that I had as a police officer. One was to become a detective, and I hadn't done that yet. And I didn't want to look back on it and regret it and take a pension or or something that I didn't necessarily, because there's a lot of people who have PTSD and need those things. I felt like I was okay. And so I wanted to come back and see what I could do. And that's what I did.
Kudos to you for that. I know that a lot of times, and and any kind of job that you have, especially if it's going to be a first responder job or having to be put in these situations, you think about after a critical incident, well, like, is this worth it? Do I want to risk this because I have kids, I'm married, I have a lifestyle that I want to live, but I want to have these goals and ambitions within the police department to still be able to bring good to my community. Is this going to outweigh that, or should I just stick with it a little bit longer, or is this not worth it? And so kudos to you for, putting that badge back on and getting back at it, because that's a hard pill to swallow. And I'm sure that was a lot of nights of thinking about, contemplating, should I just hang it up for now, or...
Oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, I'll be honest with you and your listeners, because it's something I don't run from. I could have taken 66 2/3% of my pension and tax free for the rest of my life. Would have been pretty easy, actually. And I wasn't raised that way. And there's a lot of people who need that after a situation like that. And when you need it, it's absolutely necessary and they deserve it. But as I was processing it, I said, I still have something to give. And I think I can go back, and I was one of the lucky ones, because I do have still moments, like I said, where I'll have flashbacks or whatever. I mean, I didn't walk away scot-free, but it's things that are tolerable for me. And I took about 8 months off between the trial and then obviously going through the process. But then I came back, and shortly after that, I was promoted to detective. And at that moment is when I realized I had made the right decision.
Yeah, absolutely. So after this situation, after this critical incident, you take some time off, you come back to work, you become a detective, and then you go on to do the sergeant thing, and then go into narcotics as a sergeant. And then the whole life of being in the spotlight happens.
It's interesting because even this incident that we're talking about today came up, because obviously it's public information. Again, I don't run from it. I am not embarrassed by it. It was a necessary thing that had to occur in that moment. But obviously not everyone sees it that way. As you know, some people may hear this story today and go, yeah, but did you really have to kill him? And I get it. I get it. Not being in that situation, I can understand it. And to be fair, when I had the grand jury trial, there were many questions asked of me as far as the force continuum, what was available on my duty belt that I could have deployed before that. But I know this isn't a use of force podcast, but ultimately you escalate the level of force to be competent to what the force you're receiving, which, obviously using a baton is not a suitable level of force for someone with a knife or a gun. So obviously you escalate to be at the same level or higher than the force being used against you. And that's what I did. So you have to answer those questions for civilians who aren't necessarily familiar with that. But ultimately, as someone in the public eye, I did have to answer for it. And then the best therapy for me was writing a book about it. I wrote a book called The Undercover Edge, and I wrote an entire chapter just about this moment in my life, because yes, we talk about it from a law enforcement perspective, but it changed my whole outlook on life in general, because with Selvin, not only what I witnessed, but what I went through, I realized in that moment how short life really is and how quickly it can be taken from you. And I knew that I was going to change the way I operated. I was going to take more chances. I was going to do things that I wanted to do now instead of later, because you didn't know if you were going to get another opportunity. So when I turned 30, I got promoted to sergeant. I had been watching Big Brother while I was undercover because I really couldn't go out of the house too much. And I applied one time by video. And I said, hey, I'm interested. Here we go. I didn't even go to an actual audition. And sure enough, they called me. They were interested with my story. And, the rest is kind of history from there. And again, a lot of that is because of what I experienced at 23 and how my whole outlook on life changed after that day.
That's awesome. So to wrap up here, let me ask you this. I know we talked about the peer support and all those things. Do you continue throughout the years? I know you said that, it kind of comes back to you every once in a while, but what resources would you have now, or that you utilize now, that, just for anything that you got going on in your life? Because your life is much more complex now than going through an incident like that. What are some resources that you use now that, help you get through your day to day?
So, I absolutely have the peer support team. Even after you retire, you always have the peer support team. These guys are friends of mine. They're family, some of them. So I have a close group of friends that always keep in contact with me, and I always keep in contact with them. And I actually later on became a part of the peer support team because of the experiences that I personally had. So they felt that would be an asset to the team. But as far as my personal life now, I mean, I'm someone who was totally against therapy before going through the shooting because I just had the stigma about it, where it's like, oh, I don't need that. I'm not mentally weak. And after going through therapy, which was mandatory for a police involved shooting, I had this guy by the name of Richard Crino, great guy. It really did help. It not only helped with the shooting, but other things in my life, because I'm someone who always compartmentalizes everything. So to have this impartial person who is there to listen to you and then give you objective and impartial advice about how to handle it is something you don't even always get from a friend, because they obviously want to help you, but they also want to remain friends with you. So I'm someone who's not opposed to making a therapy appointment and whether it's online or in person, to go sit down and speak with someone about some of the things I'm dealing with, whether it's personally or professionally. And I feel like therapy is a great outlet to utilize if you're going through something and you don't necessarily have a person in your life that to bounce these things off of.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think that's fantastic. I know that it's helped tremendously, and it's hard to get over that stigma sometimes of, my problems aren't as big as what these people are going for, but it is. It doesn't matter how big or small it is. Therapy is something that'll definitely benefit your life. And, if you don't like the therapist, go to the next one. I can tell you that I've been to therapists where, I think that they're good, but I think that there's better. And so I want to go to the different one. So
absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Yep. And there's so many outlets to get it now, because some people are like, I don't want to go in person. There's so many different therapy online that you can do that. I won't even promote them here, but you know them as well. And everyone knows them. But it's one of those things where there's definitely options for everyone. You can always find someone to talk to if you're going through something. The worst thing you could do is internalize it, because it's only going to end bad, because that situation will just lead to something else and you'll probably create more problems for yourself down the road.
All right. So the last thing before we get off, I've had the pleasure of meeting you, Derrick, in person in Vegas at CrimeCon, which was, it was so much fun. Me and Heather got to have a good time with you and Stephanie, and we're looking forward to the next time we see each other. But one thing I wanted to talk about, you have a podcast with Stephanie. Can you talk about that? Because you have continued the true crime in your life and have an amazing podcast. I can tell you that Heather listens to it every day when she's putting on her makeup, and then when we get into the car and go rock climbing or do something like that. So can you talk about that and what you got going on with that?
Heather's great. Heather's always DMing me like, hey, listen. So I just listened to episode 4. It's so great. But yeah, so the podcast is called Crime Weekly. It is with Stephanie Harlowe, who is a true crime YouTuber. She's known for her extensive research. She goes super in depth. And most of the cases we cover the big cases that you all know. We also cover some more obscure cases, but our kind of template, which may be different than some others, is we're super long form. So our episodes range from an hour and a half to 2.5 hours. And we do some series where it can be 2 parts, 3 parts. We've done up to 8 parts. And some of the cases we've done for that were like Casey Anthony. We've done a lot of them. And so that's kind of our shtick. It's a little different than some of the short form podcasts, but I think if you're looking for that longer format, we also do it on YouTube as well, which is different than some. We have an audio version, which is on Apple and Spotify, but we also have a YouTube channel if you want the visuals to support what we're talking about at that time.
Absolutely. That's your podcast is so great. One good thing about it that I always get a good take from is that Stephanie does such well research, and she comes, straightforward to the point. And then to hear from you from the aspect of law enforcement, of how you're discussing this case with her, like, oh, if I was this police department, this is the first thing I would do. And then it unfolds. It's a great take on all of these cases. And I'm really intrigued every time I hear it, and I learn something from it every time. So I think it's a great podcast. Me and Heather are huge fans. And so please go check that out, because that is an amazing podcast to listen to.
Thanks, Kyle. Appreciate it, man. Yeah, Big Mad True Crime, same thing. I mean, I think that's why we all get along, because we're all in it for the same reasons, right? We're trying to educate. We're trying to inform. I feel like having people like ourselves in this field is great, because there is this impression about law enforcement and we don't always get it right. And I think it's opportunities for people like you and I to come on and maybe explain the policies and the procedures and why we do things we do. Because even with Stephanie and I, we debate some things, and she said it multiple times where she didn't understand that process. And I'm able to shed some light on why we do the things we do and in the order we do them. And sometimes she agrees with it. Sometimes she doesn't. But at least for our listeners, they're getting a better understanding of what goes on behind the scenes, because in many cases, law enforcement officers, unless you're in the public relations department, you don't get to speak about the cases you're working. We're not allowed to do that. So this becomes our outlet, the microphone.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Derrick, for being on the podcast. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about your critical incident. I think it's great for everyone to hear this. Can't thank you enough for coming on here.
No, I appreciate you having me. Best of luck with the show, and I'm looking forward to seeing it because it's going to be great, and I think there's going to be a lot of good things that come from it. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, brother. To be featured on Critical Incidents, email us at criticalincidenspod@gmail.com.